Damian Cross didn't just fire her, he performed it. He waited until the entire executive floor was watching, assistants, analysts, board members, all of them. Then he leaned back in his chair, straightened his cufflinks, and said it loud enough for the hallway to hear. "Evelyn, you're done. Clear your desk. Security will walk you out." He was already reaching for his phone before she responded. She didn't cry, didn't argue, just set down her badge on the conference table with a quiet, deliberate click, and walked toward the elevator. As the doors slid shut, Damian turned back to his audience and smiled. "Finally," he said, "now we can actually move." If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or pushed aside by someone who thought they were untouchable, this story is for you. Stay with us until the very end, because what happens next is the kind of thing people talk about for years. And while you're here, hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss what's coming, and drop a comment telling us the city and country where you're watching. We want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning Evelyn Carter lost her job, the temperature in Chicago was 11 degrees and falling. She had driven to work the same way she had for the past 14 years, south on Lakeshore Drive, past the gray frozen edge of Lake Michigan, into the concrete canyon of the Loop, where the wind came off the water and hit you like something personal. She knew this commute the way you know an old scar. The rhythm of the traffic lights, the particular rattle her car made at the Wacker intersection. The coffee cart on Monroe, where the owner, a heavy-set man named Gerald, always had her medium dark roast waiting before she reached the counter. "Cold one," Gerald said that morning, handing it over. "They're all cold ones," she said, and meant it. She was 53 years old. She wore her silver hair pulled back, not styled, just contained. Her coat was wool, charcoal gray, and old enough that the buttons didn't quite match anymore. She was not a woman who spent time being decorative, and this had always been treated in certain boardrooms as a character flaw. Evelyn Carter had been Chief Operations Officer of Crossfield Capital Group for 11 years. Before that, she'd spent 3 years building their security infrastructure from nothing, back when the company was a mid-tier investment firm with ambitions bigger than its balance sheet and a technology system that would have embarrassed a small-town credit union. She had designed the protocols, written the encryption frameworks, argued, mostly alone, for spending money on systems that no one would ever see and no one would ever thank her for, until those systems were the only thing standing between the company and catastrophe. She had, over 14 years, quietly become the architecture of the place. Nobody framed it that way, of course. Damian Cross, when he gave interviews to financial publications, talked about vision. He talked about bold leadership and calculated risk and the culture of excellence he had built at Crossfield Capital. His photograph appeared in those articles, jaw set, tie perfect, the Chicago skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling glass behind him. He looked like someone who had never doubted himself for a single hour of his adult life. Evelyn's name appeared occasionally, in fine print, in footnotes, in the kind of organizational charts that journalists never bothered to read. She preferred it that way. She did not want credit. She wanted the work to be right. The problem, ultimately, was that Damian had started confusing her preference for silence with acceptance of invisibility. She rode the elevator to the 41st floor at 7:48 in the morning, 12 minutes before the official start of business, which was itself 12 minutes before the first wave of executives typically arrived. This was not unusual. Evelyn was almost always first. She had 2 meetings before 9 o'clock. A systems review with her operations team at 8, and a pre-merger technical briefing with the legal department at 8:30. The Hartwell Group merger, a billion-dollar acquisition that had been 14 months in the making, was scheduled to close in 72 hours. Evelyn had been managing the integration framework for the past 8 weeks. She was, at that exact moment, probably the single most load-bearing person in the building. She sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and found an email from Damian's assistant that had been sent at 6:17 in the morning. "Mr. Cross requests your presence in the executive conference room at 8 a.m. Full board in attendance. Please come prepared to discuss transition planning." Transition planning. She read it twice, felt something settle in her stomach, not panic, not quite, something more like a door closing. She knew what it meant. She had suspected for 3 weeks, since the afternoon Damian had walked past her in the hallway with Vanessa Cole and not acknowledged her existence, even though Evelyn had said his name. Even though they had worked in the same building for over a decade. He had simply looked through her, the way you look through a window, and kept walking. Vanessa Cole was 31, and she had been hired 6 months ago as head of strategic partnerships, which was a title that meant approximately nothing, and gave her authority over approximately everything Damian wanted her to have authority over. She had an MBA from Wharton and the kind of aggressive confidence that reads, in certain environments, as competence. She called people by their first names in a way that wasn't friendly. It was territorial. She had already, quietly, begun attending meetings that had previously belonged to Evelyn. Evelyn had watched all of this and said nothing. She had documented it instead. The conference room was full when she arrived at 7:58. Damien sat at the head of the table, in the chair with the best view of the city. Vanessa Cole was to his right, a leather portfolio open in front of her, a pen in her hand like she'd arrived prepared to take notes on someone else's humiliation. The board members, 7 of them, including Chairman Russell Holt, who was 74 years old and had the deeply tanned complexion of a man who spent most of the year somewhere warmer than Illinois, were arranged along both sides of the table. Several assistants hovered near the walls. There were people from legal, people from finance. There was no reason for this many people to be in this room for a transition planning discussion, which meant this wasn't a transition planning discussion. It was a production. Evelyn set her coffee on the table, pulled out a chair near the middle, not the end, not close to Damien. She didn't perform anything, just sat. Evelyn. Damien didn't look up from whatever he was reading on his phone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming, like she'd driven across town for a favor. Of course, she said. He put the phone down, looked at her then, directly, for the first time in what felt like weeks. There was something in his expression she recognized. It wasn't dislike, exactly. It was the particular way people look at things they've decided they no longer need. We're making some structural changes ahead of the Hartwell close, he said. Consolidating leadership roles, streamlining decision-making. After a lot of conversation and consideration, he glanced briefly at Vanessa, who was looking at her portfolio. We've decided to move the COO function into a hybrid model under strategic partnerships. Evelyn waited. Which means, Damien continued, and here his voice took on a quality that was not quite gentle and not quite cruel, but lived in the space between, your role is being eliminated, effective today. The room was very quiet. Not the silence of shock, the silence of people who already knew and were waiting to see what happened next. Evelyn looked at him steadily. Today? She repeated. Not a question, just confirming the word. We'll have HR connect with you about severance, standard package. Given your tenure, he paused, as if tenure was a mild inconvenience he was being gracious about. I think you'll find it fair. 3 days before the merger closes, she said. Something flickered in his expression. Not guilt. Closer to irritation, the way you feel when someone points out a logistical complication you've already decided to ignore. The timing is what it is, he said. Vanessa has been fully briefed on all operational priorities. The integration will continue without interruption. Evelyn turned her head and looked at Vanessa Cole. Vanessa looked back at her with an expression that was almost, not quite, sympathetic. The performance of sympathy. The slight downturn of the mouth. The small, careful nod that said, I know this is hard without actually meaning anything. Fully briefed, Evelyn said. That's right. She let the silence sit for exactly 3 seconds. Then she reached across the table, unclipped her badge from the lanyard around her neck, and set it down on the polished wood. The sound it made was very small. She stood. Okay, she said, and she turned and walked toward the door. She heard Damien behind her, heard the shift in his voice, the slight lift of performance for the benefit of the room. Security will help you with your personal items. Take whatever you need. She did not respond. She was already in the hallway. Check. Her office was on the same floor, 4 doors down. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. 14 years of her life had moved through this space. She had eaten lunch at that desk more times than she could count, usually while working, usually something from the deli on Monroe that she ate without tasting. She had sat in that chair through 3 market crashes, 2 regulatory audits, and 1 particularly bad winter when a cyber attack on a competing firm had sent every major financial institution in Chicago into a quiet, barely contained panic. She had handled all of it. Not because she was asked to handle it exactly, but because she was the person who understood what needed to be done. She picked up the framed photograph from her desk. Her niece, Maya, at 12 years old, grinning in front of a science fair project. A small plant. Her keys. A book she'd been meaning to finish for 4 months. She put these things into a cardboard box that someone had already placed in the middle of the room, which meant they had known, which meant this had been planned with enough lead time to prepare a cardboard box, and she found this detail, for some reason, the thing that almost got to her. Almost. She picked up the box and walked back to the elevator. The security guard, a young man named Theo, who had been at the front desk since 6 in the morning and who Evelyn had greeted by name for going on 3 years, looked at her with something that was close to stricken. "Miss Carter," he said quietly. "It's all right, Theo," she said. "You don't need to walk me out. I know what you're supposed to do." She smiled at him, and it was real. "Tell your daughter happy birthday. The 22nd, right?" He blinked. Yeah, that's right." "Get her something she'll remember," Evelyn said, and stepped onto the elevator. The doors closed. Behind them, she heard it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of laughter from the direction of the conference room. Damien's laugh, a big chest-forward sound, followed by other voices, the particular kind of lightness people allow themselves when attention has broken, when something they'd wanted to do is finally done. She pressed the lobby button. She did not look at her reflection in the elevator doors. She looked at the floor, at the industrial carpet she had specified years ago because it held up better than the original, something no one had ever known she'd done, and she breathed slowly. In the lobby, she pushed through the revolving door and walked out into the cold. Whoa! Gerald was still at his cart when she passed. He saw the box. His expression didn't change, but his eyes did. "To go?" he said. "No," she said. "I've got some driving to do." She walked to her car, put the box in the passenger seat, sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel, the engine running, the heat beginning to push into the cold air of the car. Her phone was in her coat pocket. She took it out and looked at the screen for a moment. Then she opened her contacts and found a name she had put there 11 months ago after a conversation at a conference that she had treated, at the time, as precautionary. Marcus Webb, FBI Financial Crimes. She had never used the number. She had hoped she would never need to. She typed a text message. "I'm available to meet, today if possible. I have documentation." She sent it, set the phone on the passenger seat, looked out at the street, at the people moving along the sidewalk in heavy coats, heads down against the wind. Then she put the car in drive. What Damien Cross did not know, what Vanessa Cole, for all her briefings and her Wharton degree and her leather portfolio, did not know, was the thing Evelyn had never explained to anyone, because no one had ever asked in a way that suggested they wanted to understand, rather than just confirm that things were running. The security infrastructure she had built for Crossfield Capital was not a conventional system. Most corporate security architecture is built around access, who is allowed in, who is kept out, what credentials open, what doors. Evelyn's system was built differently because Evelyn had understood something in her first year at the company that the executives had never grasped. The greatest threat to a financial institution wasn't outside intrusion. It was inside corruption. She had built a system that did not merely verify identity. It continuously monitored behavioral patterns, transaction timing, authorization sequences, communication metadata, the invisible fingerprint that emerges from how someone actually uses a system versus how they're authorized to use it. She had embedded this framework into every layer of Crossfield's financial network, not as a separate security overlay, but woven into the operating architecture itself. And at the center of that framework was a failsafe she had included because she had read, in 11 years of watching financial firms fail, what happened when the people at the top stopped being accountable to anyone. The failsafe was elegant in the way that good engineering is elegant, simple, almost invisible, until it mattered. It was built around a single logic. If the primary authorized administrator is removed from the system without a pre-scheduled transition protocol, the network enters a verification lockdown, not a shutdown. A lockdown. All outbound financial transfers suspended, all external API connections frozen, all merger and acquisition transaction channels closed, pending the reinstatement of a verified authorized administrator, or a transition protocol that Evelyn had designed and that only Evelyn knew how to complete. She had documented this thoroughly. She had flagged it in system memos, in quarterly security reviews, in 2 separate presentations to the board that had been listened to with the particular inattention people give to things they assume someone else is handling. No one had asked what the transition protocol required. No one had scheduled it. No one had thought to ask, what happens to the security architecture if we remove the person who built it? They had removed the person who built it. She was 11 blocks from the building, sitting at a red light on Michigan Avenue, watching a couple argue on the sidewalk, their breath making small clouds in the air, when her phone began to ring. She looked at the screen. The number was from Crossfield Capital's main executive line. She let it ring. It rang 4 more times before stopping. Then it rang again. Different extension this time, the operations floor. She turned onto Lakeshore Drive and drove north. The phone rang 3 more times in the next 8 minutes. twice from numbers she recognized, once from a number she didn't, which probably meant they were already calling from conference rooms instead of individual offices, people pulling out phones and trying anything. She did not answer. At the next light, she looked at her phone and found a response from Marcus Webb. Available at 11 a.m. My office or somewhere you prefer? She typed back. Your office is fine. I'll bring copies of everything. She set the phone down. She had a copy of everything. She had been making copies, careful, encrypted, legally airtight copies of financial records, transaction logs, internal communications, board minutes, and a great deal of documentation that Damian Cross had generated over 6 years under the assumption that Evelyn was too loyal, too quiet, or too insignificant to understand what she was reading for the past 11 months. She had not done this out of vengeance. She had done it the way she did most things, because it was the right thing to do, and because someone had to, and because no one else was going to. She merged onto the express lane and let the city fall away behind her. In the Crossfield Capital Executive Conference Room, 41 floors above the street, a trading system had just returned an error code that no one in the room had ever seen before. Vanessa Cole was already on the phone, her voice careful and even, asking questions she didn't know the answers to. Damian Cross was standing at the window, looking at the city, with an expression that had not yet become alarm. It was still in the stage of confusion, the early seconds when something goes wrong and the brain insists it must be a mistake. It was not a mistake. The countdown, as it would later be described in the federal indictment, had begun at approximately the moment Evelyn's badge hit the conference table. She drove north, and the wind came off the lake, and the city shrank in her rearview mirror, and she thought about Maya at 12 years old, grinning at a science fair, a kid who had figured something out and was proud of it, and something in Evelyn's chest that had been clenched for a very long time began, very slowly, to loosen. The error code that appeared on the trading floor at 8:47 in the morning was not dramatic. That was the first problem. It looked like a routine authentication failure, the kind of minor system hiccup that happened a few times a year, usually resolved in 20 minutes by a technician with the right credentials and a cup of bad coffee. The floor supervisor, a lean, precise man named Gordon Chu, looked at it once, flagged it to his team lead, and went back to his morning review. By 8:52, it had spread to 4 additional terminals. By 8:59, the entire outbound transfer system had returned a status that Gordon had never seen in 9 years on that floor. Authorization architecture unavailable. Pending verified administrator reinstatement. He read it 3 times. Then he picked up the phone and called upstairs. Vanessa Cole answered on the second ring, which told him she was already awake to something being wrong. We have a system-wide authentication failure on the trading floor, Gordon said. I've never seen this error category before. It's not a network issue. The internal systems are all live. It's specifically targeting outbound functions, transfers, external APIs, the merger transaction channel. Everything that touches outside the building is locked. A pause. What do you mean locked? I mean locked, he said. As in, nothing is going out. Nothing. I've tried 3 different authorization credentials, including the executive override. The system is rejecting all of them. Another pause, longer this time. He heard her say something away from the phone, low and quick, and then she came back. Get your best technician on it right now. I'm coming down. She was on the trading floor in 4 minutes, which meant she'd run most of the way, which Gordon noted without comment. He'd worked at Crossfield for 7 years, and he had never seen a member of the executive team run anywhere. Vanessa Cole arrived looking put together, but her jaw was tight in the way jaws get when someone is working hard to appear less frightened than they are. She looked at the screens, read the error message herself. Then she turned to Gordon. Where's the system documentation for this? She said. The architecture files, the security protocols. Where does Evelyn keep them? Gordon looked at her. Something moved across his face that he kept carefully neutral. I don't have access to those files, he said. That's COO-level infrastructure. It was always managed directly by Ms. Carter. She's not with the company anymore, Vanessa said, and the way she said it was very precise, very measured, like she was testing the weight of the sentence. I'm aware of that, Gordon said, which is probably why I've never needed access to those files before. Vanessa turned back to the screens, and Gordon watched her trying to figure out, in real time, the shape of the problem she was standing inside. She didn't have the right mental model yet. That was the thing. She was looking at this like a technical failure, a system glitch, something with a fix that was a few phone calls and the right password away. Gordon was starting to understand, in the slow, cold way that understanding sometimes comes, that it was something else entirely. Call it, Vanessa said. Get the head of cybersecurity in here and find out who Evelyn used as her primary technical contractor. There has to be someone who worked on this system with her. She built most of it in-house, Gordon said. Her and a team of 3 people. 2 of them left the company 2 years ago. The third one is Mark Osei. He's still in the building. 2nd floor, infrastructure team. Get him up here, she said. Now, son. Mark Osei was 28 years old, slight, with the kind of careful stillness that people develop when they spend most of their time thinking about systems rather than people. He had worked under Evelyn Carter for 4 years. He understood approximately 60% of what she had built. She had always kept the deeper architecture to herself. Not out of secrecy exactly, but because the documentation existed and she had assumed reasonably that someone would eventually read it. When he arrived on the trading floor and saw the error message, he went very still. Vanessa watched him. Do you know what this is? I know what it is, he said carefully. I don't know how to fix it. Explain. Mark looked at the screen for another moment, then turned to face her. Ms. Carter built the security framework with a fail-safe protocol. It's triggered when the primary authorized administrator is removed from the system without a pre-scheduled transition. The system goes into lockdown, outbound functions suspended, external connections frozen. The trading floor was quiet in a way it never was. People were pretending to work while listening to every word. So override it, Vanessa said. Use the executive credentials. The failsafe is designed specifically to not recognize executive credentials, Mark said. That's the point of it. It's not a bug. It's a feature. A feature, she repeated. Yes. He paused, choosing words. The system was designed to assume that if the administrator was removed without a transition protocol, something had gone wrong at the executive level. The executive credentials being rejected isn't a malfunction. It's the system working exactly as designed. Vanessa was quiet for 3 seconds. So what fixes it? Either the original authorized administrator completes the transition protocol, Mark said, or someone with the architectural access keys rebuilds the verification framework from the ground up, which would take... He stopped. Did what looked like actual mental calculation. Weeks, maybe longer. And that's if you have the original architecture documentation, which is encrypted and stored in a location I don't have access to. Who has access to it? Mark looked at her with an expression that was not quite sympathetic and not quite anything else either. Ms. Carter, he said. The silence that followed was the kind that lands differently in different people. Gordon felt it settle like a stone. Mark felt it with the particular discomfort of someone delivering news they knew would not be received well. Vanessa Cole felt it with something she would later describe, to no one, as the first real moment she understood how badly she had misread the situation she'd walked into. Upstairs, Damian Cross still didn't know the extent of it. He was in his office with Russell Holt, the board chairman, working through what they both assumed was a manageable technical issue. His assistant had told him there was a system hiccup on the trading floor. He'd told her to have Vanessa handle it. He'd poured himself a coffee and gone back to reviewing the Hartwell Group closing documents. His phone rang at 9:14. It was Vanessa. We have a serious problem, she said, and something in her voice made him set the coffee down. He walked on to the trading floor at 9:21, and the first thing he noticed was that everyone was looking at him in a way they weren't usually allowed to look at him. Direct, waiting, the way people look at someone they need something from. He didn't like it. He walked to where Vanessa and Mark Osei were standing and looked at the screens. Walk me through it, he said. Vanessa did. She was controlled, organized, covered the key points without editorializing. When she finished, Damian stood with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set and said nothing for long enough that it became uncomfortable. Then he said, "She did this on purpose." Mark Osei said very carefully, "The system was designed before today. The trigger is automatic. There's no..." "I'm not asking for a technical explanation," Damian said, and his voice had dropped into a register that people in this building knew to be cautious around. "I'm saying she built this to happen if she was ever removed. That's not a security feature, that's a trap." "It's in the documentation," Mark said. "It was flagged in the security review last March. And the one before that." Damian turned and looked at him. "What did you just say?" Mark met his eyes. He was 28 years old, and he had student loans and a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment and approximately zero desire to be in this conversation. But he also had the particular stubbornness of people who have spent their professional lives around systems. Systems either work or they don't, they're designed correctly or they're not, and no amount of authority changes that. "It was documented," Mark said again. There was a required transition protocol that needed to be scheduled whenever a change in the administrator role was planned. That protocol wasn't completed before Ms. Carter's access was revoked this morning. The trading floor was absolutely silent. Damien stared at him for a moment longer. Then he turned away and looked at the frozen screens. "Get me the Hartwell Group on the phone," he said to his assistant, who had materialized at his elbow. "And get legal in here, right now." The Hartwell Group's representative, a tightly wound woman named Patricia Stokes, came on the line at 9:47. Damien had moved to a glass-walled conference room off the trading floor, and half the executive team was crowded in around him. More people than the room was designed for, standing along the walls, trying to look less worried than they were. "Patricia," Damien said, and his voice had recovered most of its usual register. "We've had a minor technical disruption this morning." "Damien." Her voice was flat. Not hostile, just flat in the way that people get when they are deciding how direct to be. "I've been on the phone with our technical team for the last 20 minutes. The merger transaction channel is locked. We cannot access the closing framework. Our attorneys cannot complete due diligence verification. This is not a minor disruption." "It's being resolved," he said. "By whom?" He paused. "Our systems team." "Your systems team," she said, "told my systems team approximately 10 minutes ago that the resolution requires either the original system architect or a multi-week rebuild. I'm going to need you to tell me which of those options you're pursuing, and I'm going to need to know that today because our board meets at 3 o'clock Eastern Time, and they are going to ask me what is happening." In the room, nobody looked at each other. Everyone was looking at Damien or at the table or at the floor. "We're exploring both options," Damien said. "If this merger cannot close on Thursday," Patricia said, "we will need to discuss whether the timeline can be extended or whether we need to consider our position." A brief pause. "And Damien, if the issue is what my team thinks it might be, you should know that our legal team is going to have questions about the circumstances that created this situation. We have a fiduciary obligation." She ended the call. Damien put the phone down on the table. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Then Russell Holt, who had followed him down from the executive floor and was sitting at the end of the conference table with his arms crossed and his deeply tanned face set into an expression that had moved past concern into something closer to controlled fury, said, "We need to find Evelyn Carter." "I'm not," Damien started. "I'm not suggesting it as an option," Russell said, cutting him off in a tone that he only used when he wanted to remind people that he had been in boardrooms before Damien Cross was born. "I'm saying it is the only option we have right now, and we need to pursue it immediately." Damien looked at him. Something passed between them, some old tension that had probably always been there, now close to the surface. "Fine," Damien said. "Find her." They couldn't find her. Her cell phone went to voicemail. Her personal email bounced an auto-reply, not the HR-generated one Crossfield had sent, but her own, which said only, "I am currently unavailable. I will respond to messages when I'm able." Her home address was on file, but sending someone to her house, Damien's general counsel, a cautious man named Philip Graves, pointed this out quietly, might look, under certain legal frameworks, like exactly the kind of thing they did not want to be doing while a federal financial regulator was almost certainly about to start asking questions about why a major corporation's security system had locked its own executives out an hour before a billion-dollar merger. "What federal regulator?" Damien said. Philip looked at him over the top of his glasses. He was 61 years old and had been a corporate attorney for 34 years, and he was very tired. "Any number of them," he said. "A lockdown on a financial institution's outbound transfer systems, triggered by an anomalous personnel action, is the kind of thing that gets noticed by the SEC, by the CFTC, by—" He stopped, chose his next words. "By others." "We haven't done anything wrong," Damien said. Philip Graves, who had spent 34 years learning that this sentence was almost never said by people who hadn't, put his pen down on his notepad and said, "Damien, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me the same way." Damien said nothing, which Philip took as permission. In the documentation that Evelyn Carter would have had access to, in 11 years of working as COO with unrestricted access to financial records, transaction histories, internal communications, is there anything that, in the hands of investigators, would present a problem for this company, or for you personally? The conference room was very still. Damien's expression didn't change, which was itself a kind of answer. He had a very good face for situations like this, something he had cultivated over years, the ability to look steady when he was calculating. No, he said. Philip looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he picked his pen back up and wrote something on his notepad, and he didn't say anything else. By noon, the story was already leaking. Not publicly, not yet, but in the way that stories leak in financial districts, through the web of assistants and analysts and mid-level managers who pass information laterally through a dozen informal channels before anything reaches a journalist. Someone on the Hartwell Group side mentioned it to someone at a law firm. Someone at that law firm mentioned it to a contact at a competing fund. By 12:30, there were people in 3 different buildings in the loop who knew that Crossfield Capital's systems were locked and that the Hartwell merger was in jeopardy, and the word why was moving through those conversations like a current. On the 41st floor, Damien had called an all-hands with his inner circle. Vanessa Cole was there, his CFO, a heavy-set man named Brian Lattimore, who had been at the company for 8 years and who had always had the particular look of someone who knows where the bodies are buried because he helped carry them. The head of compliance, a woman named Sandra Park, who had been hired 2 years ago and who, as the afternoon developed, was beginning to quietly understand that she had been hired to provide the appearance of compliance without the reality of it. Philip Graves, still in his chair, still with his pen. Russell Holt, who had not left. "Here is what we do," Damien said. He was standing. He moved when he was working through problems. It was a habit. "We reach out to Evelyn through a third party. Not legal, not HR. Someone she knows. Someone she might actually pick up the phone for." He looked around the room. Who does she have a relationship with in this building? Who did she actually talk to? The silence in the room was the kind that accumulates meaning. Nobody wanted to answer because the answer contained an implication. Finally, Brian Lattimore said, without looking up from the table, "She talked to everyone. She knew everyone's name. The maintenance crew, the front desk, the junior analysts." He paused. "She just didn't talk to us very much." Nobody said anything to that. "Mark Osei," Vanessa said. "She mentored him. He might have a number for her." Mark Osei was brought back upstairs at 12:47. He stood in the doorway of the conference room and looked at the assembled executive team with the expression of someone who has been asked to walk into a situation they would strongly prefer to walk away from. Damien looked at him. "Does Evelyn Carter have a personal number? Something not in the company directory?" "She had the same work cell as everyone else," Mark said. "She's not answering that." "I know," Mark said. He looked at Damien for a moment. "I don't have anything else." "If you had to guess where she is..." "I don't guess about people," Mark said. "I work with systems." Something moved across Damien's face. He let it pass. "Fine," he said. "You can go." Mark turned and walked out without another word. And if there was something in his walk, a particular quality of a person who has decided something, nobody in that room was paying close enough attention to notice. Evelyn's meeting with Marcus Webb had started at 11 and run considerably longer than either of them had planned for. His office was on the 23rd floor of a federal building on South Dearborn, a spare practical space with a window that looked out onto a ventilation stack rather than the city. He was 44, black, with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, and the particular quality of attentiveness that develops in people who spend their careers listening to what people are not quite saying. He had read the documents she brought, not skimmed, read, with a yellow legal pad in front of him, taking notes, occasionally asking her to stop so he could go back over something. She sat across from him and answered his questions with the same directness she brought to everything. No embellishment, no performance, just the facts and where they came from. The documentation covered 6 years. It included internal financial records showing systematic inflation of investment returns reported to clients, the actual returns hidden in a secondary accounting framework that Damien had built with Brian Lattimore in the first year of Evelyn's tenure as COO. It included transaction logs showing transfers to shell entities that she had spent 8 months tracing to offshore accounts connected to 3 board members. It included a series of internal communications, emails, calendar invites, meeting summaries that showed a coordinated effort to conceal losses during 2 separate quarters when the actual performance would have triggered regulatory reporting requirements. She had also included, because she was thorough, a complete technical documentation of the security architecture and the reason the current lockdown had been triggered. She had not designed the lockdown as a weapon. She included this to preempt any legal theory that she had. Marcus Webb read for a long time. When he finally set the last document down, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "How long have you had this?" he said. 11 months, she said. I started pulling it together after a board meeting last January where I understood what was happening clearly enough that I couldn't pretend I didn't. Why didn't you come in then? She considered the question carefully. I wanted to make sure it was complete, she said. I wanted to make sure that when I brought it, there was nothing missing and nothing that could be explained away. He nodded slowly. And the timing today? Was not my plan, she said. I plan to bring this to you in the next few weeks. They move faster than I expected. He looked at her. You're not angry, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I'm angry, she said. I'm just not loud about it. He almost smiled. Ms. Carter, I'm going to need to make some calls. There are colleagues I need to loop in today, given the time sensitivity of the merger situation. This is going to move quickly. I know, she said. You understand what this means for the company. Yes. And for the employees, the people who work there who had nothing to do with any of this. She looked at him steadily. I've thought about them every day for 11 months, she said. I thought about them before I decided to do this, and I thought about them after. What happens to them if this keeps going is worse than what happens if it stops now. I believe that. I wouldn't be sitting here if I didn't. Marcus Webb looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked up his phone. Can you give me about 30 minutes? He said. I have nowhere else to be, she said. She sat in the waiting area outside his office, in a chair by a window that looked out at the ventilation stack, and she drank a cup of coffee from a machine in the hallway that tasted like it had been brewing since early that morning, and she waited. Her phone had 17 missed calls by then. She turned the screen over on her knee. Outside, the temperature had dropped another 3 degrees. The wind was picking up off the lake, the way it did in Chicago when the afternoon came in cold, pushing against the glass of every high-rise in the loop and making the whole city feel like something that had been assembled in a hurry and might not hold. On the 41st floor of one of those buildings, an empire was discovering that the person it had dismissed as a footnote had been, in fact, the load-bearing wall. The laughter that had filled the boardroom that morning was a very long time ago now, and the silence that had replaced it was a different kind entirely. Not the comfortable silence of people who have just gotten what they wanted, but the tight, airless silence of people who are beginning to understand the size of what they've done. Evelyn finished her coffee, crushed the paper cup, set it on the chair beside her. She picked up a 2-month-old magazine from the table and started reading an article about container gardening, and she read it slowly and carefully, the way she did everything, and she waited for Marcus Webb to finish his calls. Marcus Webb made 6 phone calls in 30 minutes, which Evelyn knew because she counted the times his office door opened, and a paralegal moved in or out with documents, a laptop, a set of folders that grew thicker with each pass. She didn't ask what was happening. She read her container gardening article. She moved on to a piece about migratory birds in the Great Lakes region. She was on her 3rd article. Something about a family in Michigan who had restored a 19th century farmhouse, when Webb's door opened and he leaned out. Ms. Carter, can you come back in? There were 2 other people in the office now. A woman in her late 30s named Agent Diane Rourke from the SEC's Enforcement Division, who had driven over from her office on West Madison in under 20 minutes, and whose hair was still damp from apparently not having had time to finish getting ready before she left. And a man named Gerald Payne, DOJ, Financial Crimes, who looked like he had been expecting a call like this for some time and was not entirely surprised it had come from this direction. Evelyn shook hands with both of them, sat back down. We've reviewed the summary, Rourke said, tapping the documents on the table. I want to ask you some questions about the secondary accounting framework, specifically the Q3 and Q4 records from 3 years ago. Of course, Evelyn said. They talked for 2 hours and 17 minutes. It was not a comfortable conversation. Rourke was precise and a little aggressive in the way that good investigators are. She asked the same question 4 different ways sometimes, not to catch Evelyn in a contradiction, but to make sure she understood exactly what the answer meant from 4 different legal angles. Gerald Payne wrote continuously and asked fewer questions, but the ones he asked were the kind that went deep into the architecture of the fraud rather than the surface of it. Evelyn answered everything. She was not performing. She was not nervous in the way of someone with something to hide, but she was also not perfectly composed. At one point, talking through a specific transaction sequence from 4 years ago that she had uncovered late on a Tuesday night in her office, alone, she stopped mid-sentence and looked at the window for a moment, and what crossed her face was not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and is only now setting it down. Take your time, Rourke said, and the aggression in her voice softened just slightly. I'm fine, Evelyn said. And then, It was a lot of money that they took from a lot of people who trusted them. I want to make sure I say it correctly. She said it correctly. By 2:15 in the afternoon, Rourke had made 3 calls of her own. Payne had drafted 2 memos on his laptop. Marcus Webb was coordinating with a federal judge's clerk on something that required, apparently, a significant amount of back and forth about timing and jurisdiction that required, apparently, a significant amount of back and forth about which federal body would take primary lead on the warrant applications given the overlapping nature of the violations. SEC jurisdiction over the securities fraud, DOJ over the wire fraud and conspiracy counts, and a third conversation happening simultaneously with the CFTC about the commodities-adjacent transactions buried in the shell entity structure. Evelyn sat in the waiting area and read her magazine and let them work. At 3:17 in the afternoon, Marcus Webb came out of his office and said, "We're going in tomorrow morning." She looked up from the magazine. "How many people?" "Enough," he said. "The warrants cover the building, all digital systems, all physical records. We're coordinating with the U.S. Marshals for the executive arrests." He paused. "I want to be clear about something. Once this moves, it moves fast and it moves publicly. Your name will be part of the public record. The documentation you provided will be entered as evidence. There will be coverage." "I know," she said. "Some of it won't be comfortable," he said. "There are people who will frame this as a personal grievance, who will say you did this because they fired you." She folded the magazine closed. "They fired me because I wouldn't help them hide what they were doing," she said. "I've been building this case for 11 months. I started before I knew they were going to fire me." "I know that," Webb said. "I'm telling you that not everyone will believe it immediately." "I know," she said again. "That's fine. The documents don't care what people believe." He nodded slowly. Then he said something she hadn't expected. "You doing okay?" She considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything. "I'm tired," she said. "I've been tired for about 11 months. I'll be okay when this is done." "Go home tonight," he said. "Get some sleep if you can. Tomorrow is going to be a long day." She went home. She didn't sleep particularly well. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind against the windows and went through the documentation in her head. Not anxiously, but methodically, the way you check a list before a long trip. Everything was where it was supposed to be. Everything was accounted for. She had done what she could do, and the rest was no longer in her hands, and she made her peace with that somewhere around 2 in the morning and slept until 6. The federal agents arrived at Crossfield Capitol at 9:41 the following morning. There were 14 of them, a mix of FBI and SEC enforcement officers, with 2 U.S. Marshals whose specific purpose became clear when they separated from the group in the lobby and took the elevator to the 41st floor while the others spread to the trading floor, the records room, and the server infrastructure on the 3rd floor. Damian Cross was in his office when they knocked. He had known something was coming, not today specifically, but coming. He had felt it in the way Philip Graves had been increasingly unreachable over the past 24 hours, in the way Brian Lattimore had called him twice that morning and hung up without leaving a message. He had felt it in the specific quality of quiet that had settled over the executive floor since yesterday afternoon, the quiet of people who are paying close attention to their own exits. When the knock came, he was standing at his window. He didn't know why. He hadn't been doing anything at the window, just standing there looking at the city the way he often did when he needed to feel the scale of what he'd built. He turned around and looked at his assistant through the glass wall of his office, and he saw her face, and he understood. He straightened his jacket, walked to the door, opened it himself. The marshal, a compact woman with close-cropped hair and the specific neutral expression of someone who has done this many times, said his name, asked him to step out, explained that he was being placed under arrest. He did not make a scene. That was the thing people remembered afterward, the ones who saw it. He didn't yell, didn't demand his lawyer immediately, didn't try to perform outrage for the floor. He looked at the marshal for a moment with an expression that was almost unreadable, and then he nodded and stepped out of his office. Vanessa Cole was arrested on the trading floor, where she had been in the middle of what she had apparently believed was a productive conversation about the system's lockdown. She saw the agents coming from across the floor, and she went very still, the way animals go still when they understand that movement won't help them. She asked to call her attorney, which she was told she could do from the federal building downtown. Brian Lattimore, in his office on the 38th floor, had apparently been attempting to print a very large number of documents when the agents arrived. The printer was still running when they walked in. The agents collected the printer along with everything else. The public story broke before noon. A journalist at the Tribune had a source inside the building. Not anyone Evelyn knew, not anyone she'd ever spoken to. The building had a lot of people in it, and some of them had phones, and some of those people made calls. And the first online piece went up at 11:52. By 1 o'clock, the television trucks were parked on West Wacker Drive. By 3, the story had national pickup. By evening, Damian Cross's photograph was on every major financial news outlet in the country. The same photograph that had appeared in all those magazine profiles, jaw set, tie perfect, Chicago skyline behind him, now recontextualized by the caption beneath it. Evelyn did not watch the coverage. She was still at the federal building, working through follow-up questions with Rourke and Payne, who needed her to clarify several technical points in the documentation now that the warrants had been executed and they had the actual servers to compare against her records. This took until 6 in the evening. When she finally walked out of the building onto South Dearborn, the temperature had dropped again and her car was covered in a thin film of frost that she scraped with a plastic scraper she kept in the glove compartment, methodically, starting from the driver's side and working across. Her phone had 43 missed calls. She didn't listen to any of them that night. She called Maya. Maya answered immediately, already knowing she'd seen it online. And for a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Maya said very quietly, "Are you okay?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "Are you sure?" Evelyn sat in the cold car and thought about it. Outside, the city moved past in both directions. A bus. A group of people in heavy coats. A man walking a dog who was very reluctant about the temperature and making his feelings known. "I think so," she said. "I'll know better in a few days." "Come for dinner," Maya said. "Tonight. I made too much food anyway." "What did you make?" "Soup. The potato one." "I'll be there in 40 minutes, Evelyn said. She drove north through the city that had been her whole professional life for 14 years, through streets that were dark and cold and absolutely indifferent to what had happened today or any other day, and she thought about none of it specifically. Not Damien, not the warrants, not the 43 missed calls. She just drove and let the city be what it was around her, and she felt more than anything the particular bone-deep fatigue of someone who has been holding something difficult for a very long time and has finally, today, put it down. The soup was good. Maya talked about her classes, Evelyn listened and ate, and at some point during the evening she realized that her shoulders had dropped from where they'd been sitting, somewhere up near her ears, for the better part of a year. The trial lasted 11 weeks. Evelyn testified for 2 days. She had expected to be nervous, and she was, a little, not about what she was saying, but about saying it in a room with that many people listening, under oath, with a stenographer typing every word and a jury of 12 people she'd never met watching her face to decide if they believed her. The defense attorney, Caroline Briggs, was skilled and thorough, and she came after the narrative hard. Wasn't it true that Evelyn had been terminated and therefore had a personal motive for this testimony? Wasn't it possible that the documentation she'd compiled reflected a selective reading of the record, curated to support a predetermined conclusion? Evelyn answered each question the same way she'd answered every question in that federal office on South Dearborn, directly, without embellishment, and with the specific, grounded calm of someone who has spent 11 months making sure that every fact she was presenting was exactly what she said it was. "Ms. Carter," Caroline Briggs said, on the second afternoon, "you've described yourself as someone who was protecting this company, but isn't it accurate that you were also, simultaneously, building a case against it?" Evelyn looked at her. "I was documenting what I observed," she said. "What I observed was that the company was being used to commit fraud. I documented it because I believed at some point someone would need to know. I protected the employees and the operational systems for the same reason I always had, because that was my job and I took my job seriously. Those two things are not contradictions." "But you didn't report it immediately," Briggs said. "You waited 11 months. "I waited until the documentation was complete," Evelyn said. "I wanted to make sure that when I brought it forward, it was airtight. I didn't want to make an accusation I couldn't fully support." "Or," Briggs said, "you were waiting until you were personally harmed before you acted." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The courtroom was very still. "I started building the documentation 8 months before I was terminated," she said. "The date stamps on the original files are in evidence. If I was waiting to be personally harmed, I had a very strange way of showing it." Several jurors looked at their notes. One of them, a middle-aged man in the third seat who had been the hardest to read throughout the trial, wrote something down. Damian Cross testified in his own defense. which his attorneys had advised against and which he had insisted on because he was, at his core, a man who believed in the power of his own presence in a room. He was composed on the stand. He was articulate. He had an answer for everything. The problem was that his answers required the jury to believe that Evelyn Carter had spent 11 years building a fraud infrastructure around him without his knowledge, had meticulously documented it over 11 months, had handed it to federal investigators the same morning she was terminated, and had somehow done all of this not because the fraud was real, but because she wanted revenge for being fired. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The verdict, when it came, was guilty on all counts. 12-0. Damien sat at the defense table when the foreman read it, and his face went through something, a sequence of expressions that moved too quickly for most people in the room to name individually. What came to rest finally was not what anyone expected. It wasn't rage. It wasn't grief. It was something quieter and harder to look at. The expression of a man who has just run out of the story he's been telling about himself. Evelyn, in the gallery, looked at her hands. She had been asked by 2 journalists and 1 true crime podcast producer in the months leading up to the verdict. Some version of the same question: how will you feel when he's convicted? She had declined to answer each time, not because she didn't have feelings about it, but because the question assumed she'd been living toward this moment the way you live toward a destination, and it hadn't been like that. The documentation, the federal investigators, the trial, these were necessary things that needed to happen, not a story she was the hero of. Real life doesn't arrange itself into those shapes cleanly, and she'd long since stopped expecting it to. What she felt when the foreman said guilty and the words settled into the room was something close to what she'd felt the morning she drove away from the Crossfield Capitol building with a cardboard box in her passenger seat and Marcus Webb's number in her phone. A quiet, private sense of something being in its right place. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just correctness. The particular feeling of a system working the way it was designed to work, which was, she supposed, the only kind of ending she had ever really understood. She stood when the room stood. She put on her coat. She walked out into the hallway and found a bench near a window and sat down. And she looked out at the city for a moment, and then she took out her phone and called Maya. "It's done," she said. Maya was quiet for a second. Then, "Come for soup?" Evelyn almost smiled. "Yes," she said, "I'll come for soup." The weeks between the verdict and the sentencing were quieter than Evelyn expected. Not peaceful. Quiet is not the same thing as peaceful, and she had learned that distinction well enough over the past year. There were depositions still being finalized, civil suits from defrauded investors moving through separate courts, and a steady low-grade presence of journalists who hadn't yet decided the story was finished. But the loudest part of it was over. The jury had spoken. What remained was paperwork and waiting and the particular anticlimactic quality of aftermath, which nobody ever quite prepares for because all the attention goes toward the event and very little toward what comes after it. She used the time to work. Not on the federal case. Her part in that was largely done. But on something she had been building quietly in the background for the better part of 9 months, the way she built most things. Without announcement, without ceremony, just steadily and with attention. The sentencing hearing for Damien Cross took place on a Thursday morning in February, 14 months after federal agents had walked through the doors of Crossfield Capitol with warrants and the particular quiet efficiency of people who have done this before and feel no need to perform it. The sentencing hearing for Damien Cross took place on a Thursday morning in February, 14 months after federal agents had walked through the doors of Crossfield Capitol with warrants and the particular quiet efficiency of people who have done this before and feel no need to perform it. The courtroom was full. Not in the way courtrooms fill for celebrity trials, not with journalists jostling and sketch artists and people who came to be entertained. This was a different kind of full. Former employees, clients who had lost money, people who had worked in that building for years and had driven in from the suburbs on a cold February morning because they needed to see it end. They sat in the gallery in their winter coats and they were mostly silent, and the silence had weight. Damien Cross sat at the defense table in a gray suit that was slightly too large for him. He had lost weight during the trial. Not dramatically, not in the way that makes a person look gaunt, but enough that the suit didn't sit right anymore, and this detail, small as it was, communicated something to everyone in the room. He looked like a man who had been maintaining a performance for so long that when the performance finally stopped, he didn't know what to do with his face. His attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Caroline Briggs, who had taken the case because it was high profile and kept it because she was too committed to walk away, sat beside him with a notepad covered in careful handwriting and an expression of someone who had done everything they could and knew it wasn't enough. Evelyn sat in the gallery, not at the front, but toward the middle, in a seat on the aisle. She wore a dark blue coat and no jewelry except the small watch she always wore. Her niece Maya, now 19 and studying computer engineering at the University of Illinois, sat beside her and held her hand without being asked, which Evelyn appreciated more than she said. The judge was a woman named Honorable Claire Vasquez, 62 years old, with short gray hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She had presided over the trial for 11 weeks. She had heard everything, every piece of documentation, every expert testimony, every attempt by the defense to reframe the narrative. She had listened with the attentiveness of someone who takes the weight of her position seriously, which was not something that could be said of everyone who had ever sat in that chair. She read the sentencing statement herself, which she didn't always do. The convictions were multiple: securities fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to defraud investors. Brian Lattimore had pleaded guilty 3 months into the investigation and cooperated, which had sealed Damien's case in ways his attorneys had spent weeks trying to unseal. Vanessa Cole had been charged separately. Her involvement in concealing the fraud in the weeks after Evelyn's termination had added obstruction charges to the original counts. Sandra Park, the compliance officer, had been the first to cooperate and had received a significantly reduced sentence in exchange. Russell Holt, the board chairman, had resigned and reached a civil settlement that cost him most of what he'd built over 40 years, which was not a criminal punishment, but was, in its way, a complete one. When Judge Vasquez announced the sentence, 22 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 14, the courtroom did not erupt. There was no gasp, no outburst, just a long collective exhale, like a room full of people who had been holding their breath for a very long time and were finally allowed to stop. Damien Cross closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then he opened them and looked straight ahead. Whatever he was feeling, he kept it where he had always kept things. Somewhere internal, somewhere that no one could see. Evelyn felt Maya squeeze her hand. She squeezed back. She did not feel triumphant. That surprised her, a little. She had expected to feel something sharper, something closer to satisfaction. What she felt instead was a kind of tired clarity, the feeling of a chapter ending, not with drama, but with the simple, definitive turning of a page. She thought about the trading floor on that January morning. She thought about Theo at the security desk, and Gerald at the coffee cart, and Mark Osei standing in the conference room saying, "It's the system working exactly as designed with that careful, precise honesty." She thought about the 214 employees who had been let go when Crossfield Capital was placed into receivership. People who had nothing to do with what happened, who had shown up and done their jobs and gone home to their families and trusted that the building they worked in was what it appeared to be. She had thought about them every day for 14 months. She was going to do something about that. She had started the process 9 months ago, quietly, while the trial was still ongoing. The Crossfield Capital headquarters building, 42 floors of glass and steel on West Wacker Drive, emptied and placed into receivership by the federal court, had been appraised at a value that reflected its legal complications. Distressed assets in ongoing federal cases don't sell easily. The building had sat for 7 months with no serious buyers, because serious buyers don't like federal entanglements, and the entanglements around this building were significant. Evelyn Carter was not a serious buyer in the conventional sense. She was a woman with a severance package, a modest investment portfolio, and a very specific idea about what she wanted to do and why. She was also, it turned out, the kind of person that serious investors wanted to back. The meetings had started small. A former colleague who had left Crossfield 5 years ago to run a logistics firm in Indianapolis. A woman named Ruth Callahan who ran a mid-sized infrastructure fund and who had heard about the Crossfield case from multiple directions and had developed a clear-eyed interest in what came next. An angel investor named Patrick Seo, who had spent most of his career backing technology companies and had recently decided he was more interested in what he called actual infrastructure, the kind that moves physical goods through real geography rather than algorithms through servers. Evelyn had met each of them once, in person, in ordinary places. A restaurant, a coffee shop. Once, with Ruth Callahan, on a bench in Millennium Park in November when it was too cold to sit outside comfortably, but neither of them wanted to be somewhere with walls and other people nearby. She brought no pitch deck. She brought the same thing she always brought to important conversations: clarity about what she was proposing and honesty about the risks. I want to buy the building, she told Ruth Callahan, and I want to launch a logistics company, regional at first, then national, built around verified supply chain transparency, full documentation at every point, no shell structures, no shadow accounting, every contract publicly auditable by any client who asks. Ruth looked at her. The wind off the lake was considerable, and her hair was doing something she was pretending not to notice. That's either the best idea I've heard this year or the most naive, she said. Why would a logistics company need to be built in a building associated with the biggest financial fraud case in Illinois history? Because, Evelyn said, the people who need to trust this company need to see that the building doesn't own us. We own it. We walked into that building. That matters to the people I want to hire, and it'll matter to the clients I want to serve. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Who are you planning to hire? People who were let go when this company went under, Evelyn said. The ones who were good at their jobs and had nothing to do with what happened. I've kept a list. Ruth looked at her steadily. You've kept a list? For 8 months, Evelyn said. Ruth Callahan was not a sentimental investor. She had not built her fund on sentiment, but she was a thorough one, and she had done enough research on Evelyn Carter by this point to know that a list kept by this particular woman was not a gesture. It was a plan. She said she'd think about it. She called back in 4 days. The purchase of the building cleared federal court approval 6 weeks before the sentencing. Northbridge Logistics LLC was incorporated in the state of Illinois 3 days after that, with Evelyn Carter as founder and CEO and a board that included Ruth Callahan, Patrick Seo, and 2 former operations executives from companies that had nothing to do with Crossfield Capital's history. The name had been Maya's idea, half joking, over dinner one night when Evelyn had been staring at a piece of paper with a list of rejected options. Northbridge, Maya said, reaching across the table for more bread. You're building a bridge. You're on the north side. It's not complicated. Evelyn looked at the paper. It's too simple. Simple is good, Maya said. Simple is the opposite of everything those people did. Evelyn wrote it down. It stayed. The first call she made after incorporation was to Mark Osee. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been expecting it, or at least not surprised by it. She had a feeling he'd been following the building purchase in the court filings. He was the kind of person who followed things in court filings. I'm starting a company, she said. I need someone who understands infrastructure and isn't impressed by people with titles who don't know what they're talking about. A pause. What kind of company? Logistics. Regional distribution network. Technology heavy on the transparency and audit side. Another pause. Longer. Is this going to be the kind of place where they actually let the technical people make technical decisions? That's the only kind of place I know how to build, she said. Okay, he said. When do you need an answer? Now would be fine, she said. He was quiet for about 4 seconds. Okay, he said again. Yes. She called Gordon Chu next. He took longer. He had found a new job 3 months after Crossfield folded, a floor supervisor position at a trading firm downtown, and he was not unhappy there, which made the decision harder. They talked for 40 minutes, which was unusual for both of them. At the end of it, he said, The team I had on that floor, there were 6 people who were really good, who got let go and haven't landed yet. Send me their names, Evelyn said. I have most of them on my list already, but send me yours. He sent them that evening. 4 of the 6 were on her list. The other 2 she called the following morning. Over the next 3 months, she hired 23 people. Not all of them came from Crossfield. Some were from other companies, other industries, people who had been referred by Ruth Callahan or Patrick Seo or found through a quiet word-of-mouth process that Evelyn ran the same way she ran everything, carefully, without fanfare, focused on whether the person in front of her was honest and capable rather than on what their resume was designed to make her think about them. She interviewed everyone personally. Not in a formal way. She didn't use structured interview formats or standardized questions. She took people for coffee or for a walk, asked them about problems they'd solved that hadn't gone the way they'd planned, asked them about times they'd disagreed with someone senior and what they'd done about it. She was interested in how people handled being wrong and how they handled watching other people be wrong. These were, in her experience, the 2 things that most reliably predicted whether someone would thrive in an environment that valued honesty over comfort. One of the people she hired was a woman named Deanna Rogers, who had been a junior operations analyst at Crossfield, 26 years old, had been there 18 months before the company folded. She'd worked for Evelyn indirectly, 2 management layers removed, and Evelyn doubted Deanna had said more than 30 words to her during that time. But her name was on the list because Gordon Chu had mentioned her in passing once, months ago, as someone who caught things other people missed. Deanna arrived for the coffee meeting, a diner on South Michigan, booths and fluorescent lighting and coffee that was reliably mediocre, with a notepad already open and 3 questions she'd prepared, which she apologized for immediately. "Don't apologize," Evelyn said. "What are your questions?" Deanna looked at the notepad. "What does the audit transparency actually mean in practice? Like, who sees what and when? Second, what's the plan if a client tries to pressure us to obscure something? And third," she stopped. "The third one's more personal." "Go ahead." "Why are you starting this here, in that building? You could start this anywhere. Why go back to that building?" Evelyn looked at her for a moment. She liked the questions. She liked that the third one required more nerve than the first 2. To the first 2, she said, the transparency model means every client gets real-time audit access to their supply chain documentation. No redacted records, no summary reports that smooth over the details. If something goes wrong in the chain, they see it when we see it. As for clients who want to pressure us, we'll lose those clients. That's built into the business model. We're not trying to be the company for everyone. We're trying to be the company for people who actually need it to work. She picked up her coffee. As for the building, because the people I'm hiring need to see that it can be different. Not that it will automatically be different, but that someone decided to walk in and make it different. That's not symbolic. It's a statement of intent, and statements of intent matter when you're asking people to trust you. Deanna looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote something in her notepad, closed it, and said, "Okay, I'm in if you want me." "I want you," Evelyn said. "Finish your coffee." The first day anyone set foot in the building as a Northbridge employee was a Monday in late April, 8 weeks after the sentencing. It was a warmer day than Chicago usually allowed in April, 62 degrees and genuinely sunny, the kind of day that felt like a negotiation the city had finally won. The building's lobby had been repainted. The old Crossfield Capitol branding had been removed. In its place, on the wall behind the reception desk, someone had mounted a simple panel of brushed steel with the company name and below it, in smaller letters, built on what actually works. Mark Ossie had suggested the phrase. Evelyn had changed 2 words and kept the rest. 23 people walked into that building on that first day. They came at different times, some early, some right at 9, one person who arrived at 9:14 because the L was delayed and who sent a text apologizing, which Evelyn read and did not respond to because being 14 minutes late due to a train delay did not require an apology. She stood in the lobby for a while and watched people come in. She had a coffee from a cart on the corner, not Gerald's cart, which was still on Monroe, a different corner, a different guy. And she held it with both hands and watched her people walk through a door that used to mean something else and now meant something different. She was not swept up in the moment. She was tired, actually. She had slept badly the night before, the way she often did before large beginnings, and her lower back hurt from too many hours at her desk over the past week. And she had a call in 45 minutes with a potential client in Milwaukee that she was not fully prepared for. Things were not perfect. They were not going to be. That was fine. Ruth Callahan called at 9:22. "How's the first day?" "Quiet," Evelyn said, "which is good." "You nervous?" Evelyn thought about it honestly. "A little," she said. "Not about the company. About whether I'm asking people to trust something that I'm confident in, but can't guarantee." "That's just leadership," Ruth said. "I know," Evelyn said. "I don't love it." Ruth laughed, a short, real laugh. "Nobody does. Call me after Milwaukee." The Milwaukee call went well enough. Not perfectly. The potential client had questions about pricing that Evelyn didn't have final numbers for yet, and there was a moment midway through where the conversation got slightly stuck on a technical specification that she needed to loop Mark in on rather than answer herself. She said so directly. "I'm going to get you a precise answer from my infrastructure lead and follow up by end of day." The client seemed more reassured by that than by any smooth, immediate answer would have made them. She followed up at 4:53 with a note from Mark that answered the question and included 2 additional specifications the client hadn't asked about but would need to know. The client responded within the hour. "This works for us. Let's schedule a follow-up." It was not a contract. It was a follow-up, but it was something. In Federal Correctional Facility in Terre Haute, Indiana, Damian Cross was learning the specific dimensions of a space that was not his office, not his apartment, not the conference room with the best view of Chicago. He was learning the sound a building makes when the people inside it are not there by choice, and the way time moves differently when you are not the one deciding how to spend it. He was not broken. He was not reformed, not yet, possibly not ever in any complete sense. He was something more complicated than either of those things. A man sitting with the consequences of his own decisions in a place where there was nothing to do but sit with them. He had lawyers still working on appeals that his remaining money was paying for. He had people on the outside who sent letters sometimes and visited less often than they'd initially promised. What he did not have was the architecture of the thing he'd built. The company, the building, the framework of authority and fear, and the particular respect that comes from being the person everyone needs something from. All of that was gone, and its absence was a constant, low-grade presence, like a sound just below hearing. He had heard, through a former colleague who still wrote to him, that Evelyn Carter had bought the building. He sat with that for a long time. He had a lot of time to sit with things. Vanessa Cole had received 4 years, reduced from 7 for cooperation. She was serving her sentence in a minimum security facility in Michigan. Brian Lattimore had received 3 years, also reduced, and was out in 2 with good behavior, working as an accounting consultant in a small firm in Ohio that did not advertise its connection to his past. Russell Holt had paid his civil settlement and moved to Arizona, where he played golf and was not mentioned in financial circles anymore. The world had moved on the way the world does, not forgetting exactly, but filing things away, making room for the next thing. The Hartwell Group had found a different acquisition target and completed a merger 18 months after the Crossfield collapse. The employees who'd been let go had mostly landed somewhere, some better than before, some not. The clients who'd lost money had received partial restitution through the federal recovery process, which meant they got back some of what they lost and had to make peace with the rest. Northbridge Logistics, by the time the first fall arrived, had 7 active clients in 3 states. It was not large. It was not profitable yet. Ruth Callahan had modeled 18 months before break-even, and Evelyn held that number in her head like a compass bearing. But it was functioning. It was real. And the people inside it came to work in the morning with an energy that Evelyn recognized from the early years at Crossfield, before the culture of fear and performance had settled over the place like sediment. The energy of people who believe in what they're doing and trust the people they're doing it with. It was not perfect. There were disagreements. There was a bad week in September when a critical shipment tracking system went down for 6 hours because of an integration error that Mark and his team should have caught in testing and didn't, and the client was unhappy, and rightfully so. And Evelyn sat in a room with the client and listened without defending and agreed with the parts they were right about and explained clearly, without excuses, what had happened and what was being changed. The client stayed, not because Evelyn charmed them, but because she told them the truth. There was a hire in October that didn't work out, a mid-level operations manager who had come with strong references and whose actual judgment in the day-to-day turned out to be inconsistent in ways that affected his team. The conversation to let him go was difficult and took longer than it should have, partly because Evelyn was conscious of the weight of that word after what had been done to her, and she wanted to be sure she was doing it for the right reasons in the right way. She was. She did it. It was still uncomfortable. These were the textures of a real thing. Nothing built by people and run by people is clean at the edges. Evelyn knew this better than anyone. What mattered was the center of it, what the company actually was, and what it was trying to be. She checked the center of it regularly, the way you check a foundation, looking for cracks. So far it held. On a Friday evening in November, after everyone else had gone home, she sat at her desk on the 14th floor. She had deliberately not taken the executive suite on the 41st, had given that floor over to common workspace and storage, and looked out at the city as the lights came on across the loop. The lake was dark and enormous beyond the buildings. The temperature had dropped again. Winter was returning to Chicago with its usual lack of ceremony. Her phone had a voicemail from Maya, something about a project she was excited about, her voice quick and full. A text from Ruth. Q3 numbers look better than projected. Good week. On email from Gordon Chu with the subject line, "This is a good problem to have," which she opened and read. He was telling her that 2 new clients had both asked for an expanded service that Northbridge wasn't currently offering, which meant a decision about whether to build that capacity sooner than planned. She wrote back, "Let's talk Monday. Bring numbers." She put her phone down, looked at the city. Did not think about not specifically. It wasn't that kind of evening. It was the kind of evening where you sit quietly with the fact of having survived something and built something and you let it be what it is, without pressing it into meaning more than it does. Outside, Chicago was doing what it always did, moving, loudly, indifferently, full of people going somewhere, and people coming from somewhere, and the wind off the lake that cared about none of it. The city had been there before Northbridge, and it would be there long after, and this was not a sad thought but a grounding one. Evelyn Carter turned off her desk lamp, picked up her coat, and went home. The winter that hit Chicago in Evelyn's third year of running Northbridge was not a normal winter. It started in the second week of January with a storm system that meteorologists had been tracking for 4 days, and that still managed to be worse than anyone predicted when it actually arrived. 31 inches of snow fell in 48 hours. The temperature dropped to -22 with wind chill. Lakeshore Drive closed for the first time in over a decade. O'Hare went dark. The L ran on emergency schedule, which meant it barely ran at all. The mayor declared a city emergency, and the news network sent correspondents to stand on street corners in parkas and shout into cameras about historic conditions, which was the kind of thing that happened every few years in this city and never quite stopped feeling shocking. Northbridge had seen it coming, not because Evelyn had better weather intelligence than anyone else, but because she had spent the previous November building what Mark Osei called the contingency grid, a pre-mapped logistics network of alternative routes, local depots, partner warehouses, and verified carrier relationships that didn't depend on the infrastructure everyone else depended on. She had done this because 3 years into running a logistics company in the Midwest, she had learned that the question was never if the supply chain would fail. It was when and how badly, and whether you had already thought about what to do when it did. She had thought about it. Her team had thought about it. They had run scenarios, argued about them in conference rooms, revised the plan twice based on what Gordon Chu called the reality test. If something fails at 3 in the morning in a blizzard, does this plan still work? They had trimmed it down to the parts that would actually function under pressure and cut the parts that looked good on a spreadsheet, but required conditions that emergencies don't provide. When the storm hit on a Tuesday night, Evelyn was already at the office. She had come in at 7 in the evening with a bag that had 2 days' worth of clothes, because she had looked at the forecast and made a decision. Several other people from her team had done the same thing without being asked. Gordon arrived at 8 with a sleeping bag and a very large thermos. Deanna Rogers, who had grown in 3 years from junior analyst to the person Evelyn trusted most with real-time problem-solving, showed up at 9 with her laptop and a look on her face that said she had already been running through contingency scenarios in her head for the past 2 hours. "Milwaukee Depot is confirmed," Deanna said, dropping into a chair across from Evelyn's desk. "Rockford is a question mark. The carrier we have on contract there is saying his drivers won't go out, which, fair enough, but we need to know by 6 a.m. whether we're rerouting." "Call him directly," Evelyn said. "Not dispatch. Him." "Already tried. Went to voicemail." "Try again at midnight, and again at 3. Evelyn looked at the weather map on her screen. "If he's not answering by 3, start working the backup carriers on the secondary list. Start with the ones we've actually used before, not the ones who are just on the list." Deanna nodded and was already typing. "What about the hospital contracts?" This was the part that mattered most, and everyone in the room knew it. Northbridge had, in its second year of operation, quietly taken on 3 hospital supply contracts in the greater Chicago area. Not because it was the most lucrative segment of their business, it wasn't, but because Evelyn had made a deliberate decision that the company would take on work that actually mattered to the functioning of the city, even when that work was complicated and the margins were tight. It was one of the decisions that Ruth Callahan had initially questioned, gently, in a board call. "The margins on hospital supply are thin," she'd said, "and the liability exposure is real." "I know," Evelyn said. "We're doing it anyway." Ruth had been quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay, make sure the contracts have the right protective language." They had the right protective language. And now, on the second night of the worst winter storm in a decade, they had hospitals that were counting on Northbridge to get supplies through. "The hospital contracts are priority 1, Evelyn said. "Everything else waits if it has to. Pharmaceuticals, surgical supplies, the temperature-sensitive inventory from Northwestern's secondary campus. I want a status on all 3 by 10 p.m. tonight, and I want someone physically on the phone with each of those facilities, not just email." "I'll take Northwestern," Gordon said from across the room, already reaching for his phone. "I'll do Mercy General," said a voice from the doorway. James Whitfield, their head of carrier relations, a broad-shouldered man from the South Side, who had spent 15 years in freight logistics, and who Evelyn had hired partly because he knew every independent carrier operator in the greater Midwest by first name. "I've got a guy with a heavy-duty rig who can do the pharmaceutical run. He's done cold weather runs before. Let me make some calls." "Do it," Evelyn said. "Tell him we'll cover a 20% weather premium. That's approved right now. I don't need to see paperwork." James was already out of the room. The night was long. It was not heroic in the cinematic sense. It was not smooth or triumphant. There were no swelling moments where everything suddenly worked. The Rockford carrier came through at 2:40 in the morning, having finally answered his phone when James called from a different number. A temperature sensor in one of the transport units failed at 4 a.m. and had to be manually bypassed by a driver who was standing in negative 18-degree wind and talking to Mark Osei on the phone while Mark walked him through the process step by step. A supply delivery to Mercy General arrived 45 minutes later than the contracted window because the driver had to navigate around a jackknifed semi on the expressway, and Evelyn called the hospital's supply director herself to explain and was told, in a tired and genuinely grateful voice, "You're the only contractor who called us. Everyone else just didn't show." By Wednesday morning, all 3 hospital contracts had been fulfilled. 2 of Northbridge's regular commercial clients had called to release Northbridge from their delivery obligations given the conditions, which was decent of them, and Evelyn had accepted gracefully and noted both companies in a mental file she kept of people who behaved decently under pressure. One client, a regional retail chain whose account Northbridge had taken on 6 months ago, called at 7 in the morning demanding to know why their non-essential merchandise delivery had been deprioritized. Gordon took the call. He was running on 3 hours of sleep and the remnants of a thermos that had long since gone cold, and he listened to the client's representative escalate through 3 different registers of indignation before he said evenly, "We were running pharmaceutical deliveries to hospitals last night. If that's not the priority order you wanted, you should let us know and we can discuss whether our service model is a fit for your needs." The client's representative went quiet, then said they would call back. They called back 2 hours later and said they understood and thanked Northbridge for the work they'd done. Evelyn heard about this exchange secondhand and said nothing, but something in her expression when Gordon told her said everything it needed to say. The storm coverage reached national news by Thursday. The human interest angle, logistics companies that had abandoned deliveries versus the few that hadn't, found its way into several stories, and Northbridge's name appeared in 2 of them. Not prominently, not as the hero of the story, just as one of the companies that had kept the chain moving when others hadn't, which was exactly the kind of coverage that Evelyn found tolerable. She gave one interview to a journalist from a Chicago business publication, and she kept it short. She said that the company had prepared for this scenario because preparation was cheaper than crisis. She said that the people who had done the actual work, the drivers, the depot operators, the people who stood in the cold and solved problems at 3 in the morning, were the story, not the company name. She said that the hospital contracts existed because someone had to take them, and she thought Northbridge was better positioned than most to do it correctly. The journalist asked, "Is this the kind of company you always wanted to build?" Evelyn thought about the question. Outside the window of the small conference room where they were sitting, the city was slowly digging itself out, plows grinding along the streets, people shoveling sidewalks, with the particular grim efficiency of Chicagoans who have done this before. "I didn't come from a position of wanting to build a company," she said. "I came from a position of having learned what doesn't work and believing something different was possible." She paused. "I've been wrong about enough things in my life to know that I could be wrong about this too. What I'm not wrong about is the people I hired and why I hired them. The rest of it, the growth, the recognition, that comes from the work or it doesn't. I try not to think about it too much." The article ran the following week. It was read by, among other people, 2 logistics executives in different cities who reached out to Northbridge about partnership discussions. One of those discussions led, 8 months later, to Northbridge's first contract outside Illinois. There was a challenge that came at the end of that same year that was harder than the storm, in the way that human threats are always harder than weather. His name was Conrad Rice. He ran a company called Meridian Freight Solutions, which operated in several of the same regional markets as Northbridge, and which had, over the past year, been losing business to them in ways that Conrad found personally offensive. He was 67 years old and had been in freight logistics for 40 years, and he was accustomed to a particular hierarchy in the industry that Northbridge's existence was quietly disrupting. He started with the indirect approach. A conversation with one of Northbridge's larger clients, a pharmaceutical distributor in Milwaukee, that Evelyn heard about 3 days later through a contact she trusted. Conrad had suggested, in the carefully vague way that people like him do, that Northbridge's audit transparency model was a liability rather than an asset, that clients who wanted Northbridge's full real-time documentation were essentially inviting regulatory scrutiny into their own operations, and that sophisticated companies usually preferred a more discreet logistics partner. The Milwaukee client called Evelyn directly. "I want you to hear this from me," the client's operations director, a woman named Sheila Granger, said. "Not because I'm considering switching, I'm not, but because you should know someone is saying this." "I appreciate it," Evelyn said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him our legal team specifically chose Northbridge because of the transparency model," Sheila said, "and that discreet is a word we associate with things we'd rather not have to explain later." "That's a good answer," Evelyn said. "When Conrad Rice's pressure didn't work through clients, he tried a different avenue. He had connections, old ones, the kind built over 4 decades in an industry that had its share of people who preferred not to be looked at directly. He made calls suggesting that Northbridge's board structure had conflicts of interest, that Evelyn's background included involvement in the cross-field capital fraud rather than exposure of it, that the company's rapid growth in hospital contracts was worth scrutiny. None of it was true, and the documentation to prove it wasn't true was all public record. But Evelyn knew, from experience, that the truth being available and the truth being heard are two different things, and that people who want to create doubt don't need to be convincing. They just need to be loud enough and persistent enough that people start to wonder. She called Ruth Callahan. "I know," Ruth said, before Evelyn finished explaining. "I heard from Patrick yesterday. Conrad Rice has been making calls." "What do you want to do?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I want to know what you want to do. Because this is your company. I have opinions, but I'm aware of whose name is on the door." Evelyn appreciated that. "I want to be very careful about not doing anything that looks defensive," she said, "because defensive looks like we have something to be defensive about." "Agreed. And I want to put together a clear, factual response. Not a press release, not anything public yet. Just a clean document with the timeline and the public records that address every specific claim he's making, and I want our board members and our major clients to have it in their hands before the week is out. I can help draft that. I'd like Mark to pull the documentation. He's faster than anyone, and he won't editorialize." "What about Rice directly?" Evelyn thought about it. "Not yet. He's hoping for a confrontation. If I go at him directly now, it becomes a fight between two companies, and the story is the fight. If I respond with facts and let the facts speak for themselves, the story is the facts." She put together the document over 2 days with Mark and Ruth. It was not dramatic. It was very boring in the way that thorough, accurate documentation is boring, organized, sourced, cross-referenced, the kind of thing that is completely unanswerable precisely because it never raises its voice. It went to Northbridge's board, their top 12 clients, and 2 industry journalists who had covered the company before and who Evelyn trusted to read it carefully. Conrad Rice made 2 more calls in the following week. Then the calls stopped. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge what he'd done. He simply stopped, the way people do when they realize that the person they're coming after isn't going to give them a fight and isn't going to back down either, and that continuing costs them more than it costs their target. Evelyn noted this without satisfaction. She had known people like Conrad Rice her whole career, men who had operated long enough in environments that rewarded aggression that they'd stopped being able to distinguish between aggression and strength. He wasn't malicious in a calculated way. He was just a person who had learned one way to be powerful and couldn't conceive that there were other ways that worked better. She felt something almost like sympathy for him, which surprised her, and she didn't press it. She had work to do, Chung. The letter arrived in the spring of Evelyn's 4th year at Northbridge. It came through the prison mail system, forwarded by the Federal Facilities Communications Office, and it sat in her inbox for 2 days before she opened it because she recognized the handwriting on the outside of the envelope, and she needed 2 days to decide she was ready to read it. Damian Cross had written 3 pages in the careful, slightly cramped handwriting of someone who doesn't write by hand often and is trying to be precise. He did not ask for anything. She had expected some kind of ask, an appeal for her help with something, a request for a letter of support for some legal process, something that would have made the letter easier to understand and easier to dismiss. There was none of that. He wrote about the trial, about the moment when Evelyn had presented the system logs in court, and he had understood, sitting at the defense table, that there was nothing to argue against, not because the lawyers hadn't tried, but because the documentation was simply true, and you cannot argue effectively against things that are simply true. He wrote that he had spent months afterward being angry about this, which he acknowledged was not rational. He wrote that the anger had eventually become something else that he didn't have a clean name for. He wrote, near the end of the 2nd page, I told myself for a long time that you did this to me. I've stopped believing that. What I'm less certain about is whether I ever actually understood what I had in that building, or whether I was the kind of person who was only capable of understanding the value of something after it was gone. The third page was shorter. He said he had heard she'd bought the building and started a company and that it was doing well. He said he didn't know if she would read this letter and that he wasn't writing it because he expected a response. He said that the thing he came back to, in the long hours of having nothing but time to think, was the morning he fired her, the way she had set her badge down on the table quietly, without anger, and walked out. He wrote, I laughed after you left. I want you to know that I understand now what I was laughing at, and it wasn't you. He signed it with his first name. Evelyn read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in a drawer. She did not write back. She thought about it, sat with the question for several days, the way she sat with most hard questions, and decided that there was nothing she could say in a letter to Damian Cross that would be useful to either of them. What he was working through was his own work to do. She could not help him do it, and she was not going to pretend she could. The most honest thing she could give him was the space to do it without her participation, and so that was what she gave him. She told no one about the letter, except Maya, one evening over dinner. Maya listened, then said, How do you feel about it? Tired, Evelyn said, and a little sad. Not for him specifically, just sad that it takes some people so long to see clearly. Does it change anything for you? Evelyn thought about it. No, she said, but it completes something. I don't know how to explain that exactly. Maya nodded. She was 22 now, in her final year at Illinois, had the kind of clear-eyed pragmatism that Evelyn recognized as a younger version of her own and was quietly proud of without saying so directly. You don't need to explain it, Maya said. I think I understand. They ate in comfortable quiet for a while. The restaurant was warm and slightly too loud the way good restaurants always are. And outside, Chicago was moving through a spring evening, still cold, but with the particular quality of cold that has direction, cold that is going somewhere, giving way to something. What Evelyn understood by her fifth year, in ways she couldn't have articulated when she first walked into the Northbridge building with 23 people and a company name, her niece had suggested half-joking over dinner, was that the story people told about what she had done, the fired executive who brought down a corrupt empire and built something better, was both true and incomplete. It was true in the facts. The rest of it was more complicated. The thing that had actually made everything possible was not cleverness or strategy or even the security architecture she'd built. It was something more mundane and more durable than any of those things. She had done her job honestly, for 14 years, without requiring recognition for it, and she had paid attention. That was all. She had paid attention to the systems and to the people and to the gap between what the company said it was and what it actually did, and she had kept records because the truth has a way of needing to be recoverable, and eventually, when it mattered, the records were there. This was not a remarkable story about a remarkable woman, or at least that was not how she thought about it. It was a story about what happens when someone does ordinary things correctly over a long enough period of time. The quality that saved her, that saved the people who counted on her, that eventually made Northbridge possible, wasn't heroism. It was consistency. The refusal to stop being honest when honesty was inconvenient. The refusal to stop paying attention when attention wasn't rewarded. The refusal to let the people who defined her as invisible convince her that invisibility was the same thing as powerlessness. Damian Cross had called her a footnote, not in those exact words, but in every way that mattered, in the dismissive tilt of his attention, in the years of her name appearing in fine print, while his appeared in photographs, in the Tuesday morning when he fired her in front of an audience because he believed her departure was a management problem. He was solving, rather than a structural failure, he was creating. He had confused her quietness with smallness. He had confused her patience with passivity. He had looked at a woman who didn't need to be the loudest person in the room and concluded she must not be the most important one. He had been wrong in a way that turned out to be catastrophic, but the wrongness wasn't unique to him. Evelyn had worked in enough buildings with enough Damians to know that this particular mistake, mistaking loudness for leadership, mistaking visibility for value, was not one man's character flaw. It was a pattern. It was how certain environments were built and what they selected for, and what they eventually destroyed themselves with. She was not interested in being angry about that, not anymore. She was interested in building an environment that made different choices. What? In the fall of her fifth year, Northbridge Logistics expanded its operations to 4 additional states and hired its 83rd employee. The 83rd employee was a 24-year-old named Calvin Park, who had applied for an entry-level route coordination position and whose interview with Deanna Rogers had produced this report. He asked more questions about how decisions get made here than about salary. I think that's a good sign. Evelyn read the report and said hire him. The company was profitable, had been for 14 months, which was 4 months ahead of Ruth Callahan's initial model. Ruth had called to note this with the particular understated pleasure of someone who doesn't often let themselves be pleased, and was allowing it this once. "You built something real," Ruth said. "We built something real," Evelyn said. "You and Patrick and everyone in that building." "Don't deflect the credit," Ruth said. "You hate it when people do that." "I'm not deflecting. I'm being accurate." "Fine. We built something real." "Yes," Evelyn said. "We did." The building on West Wacker Drive had been transformed in ways both visible and invisible. The executive floors had been reorganized into collaborative workspace. The lobby no longer felt like the entrance to a place where power was being performed. It felt like the entrance to a place where work was being done. The people who worked there moved through it with the particular ease of people who know where they stand and trust the ground under them. Not perfectly. Nothing is perfect. There were still hard weeks and wrong calls and conversations that went sideways, and projects that didn't work out the way anyone hoped. Evelyn still slept badly before big decisions. She still occasionally caught herself second-guessing a hire or a contract or a choice she'd made under pressure. She was not a different person than she had been. She was the same person, in a different position, with better information about what she was capable of. On a Thursday evening in October, the same month, Northbridge hit its 83rd hire. Evelyn stayed late again. She always stayed late, this had not changed, and sat by the window on the 14th floor with a coffee that had gone cold and looked out at the skyline. The city was lit up against an early dark sky, the lake invisible beyond the buildings but present the way it always was, felt if not seen, the cold weight of it at the edge of everything. She had looked at this view from this window many times now. It was becoming familiar in the way that things become familiar when you have chosen them, not passively familiar, not the familiarity of something you ended up with, but the kind that comes from having decided and kept deciding. She thought about the morning she had driven here for the last time as a Crossfield employee, the last time she had ridden that elevator with a cardboard box and listened to laughter filling the space she was leaving. She thought about the drive north on Lakeshore Drive with her phone ringing and the lake dark beside her. She thought about Marcus Webb's waiting room and a cup of bad coffee and a magazine about container gardening. She thought about all of it with the particular quality of attention that you bring to something you have moved through and survived and are now on the other side of, not nostalgia, which is soft at the edges and slightly dishonest, but something clearer, the clear-eyed acknowledgement that it happened, that it was hard, that it led here. Here was good. Here was real. Here was something she had built with people she trusted from a building that used to mean one thing and now meant another. She finished her cold coffee, picked up her coat, turned off the light. The elevator took her down through the building that had once belonged to a different story, and she walked through the lobby, the brushed steel panel on the wall, built on what actually works, catching the light from the street outside, and pushed through the door into the Chicago evening. It was cold. It was always cold. The wind came off the lake like it always did, like it had before any of them arrived and would after all of them were gone. She walked to her car, and the city moved around her, indifferent and enormous and full of people doing the same thing she was doing, trying to build something that would hold, trying to find solid ground, trying to figure out what they owed the world and what it owed them. There are no clean endings to stories like this. Damian Cross was still in a federal facility in Indiana, working through his years with the slow, grinding patience of a man who has no choice but patience. The people who had worked under him were scattered across the landscape of their own second acts, some better, some still finding their footing. The money that had been stolen had been partially recovered and would never be fully recovered, and the clients who'd lost it had made their peace or hadn't, and the city had moved on because cities always move on. And Evelyn Carter drove home through the Loop on a Thursday in October, through streets she knew the way, you know something you have chosen to stay with. And what she felt, not triumphant, not healed in some final and complete way, just real, just present, just alive in the specific and imperfect life she had made, was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. The lesson, if there is one, is not that patience is always rewarded, or that honesty always wins, or that the good people inevitably outlast the corrupt ones. The world doesn't work that cleanly. What's true, What Evelyn Carter's story actually demonstrates, underneath the drama of the trial and the system lockdown and the federal warrants, is something quieter and harder to hold on to. It's this: the work you do when no one is watching is not lost. The attention you pay when it isn't required is not wasted. The integrity you maintain when it would be easier not to doesn't disappear just because no one acknowledges it. It accumulates. It becomes the architecture of who you are. And when the moment comes, as it sometimes does, not always, but sometimes, when the whole weight of a situation presses down on a single point, the only thing standing between collapse and survival is whatever was actually built there, by whoever actually built it, one honest day at a time. Evelyn Carter had built something real in the years when no one was looking, inside a building full of people who had stopped seeing her, and when they removed her, they discovered what they had. Some lessons cost more than others. This one cost everything. The months that followed Evelyn's late October evening at the window did not arrive with ceremony. They arrived the way most important stretches of life arrive, incrementally, unremarkably, one morning after another that didn't announce itself as significant until it was already behind you. Northbridge's expansion into the 4 new states created the kind of operational stress that no amount of planning fully prepares you for. Ohio was manageable. Indiana came with a carrier network that James Whitfield understood well enough to navigate. Wisconsin was straightforward. Michigan was the problem. The Michigan market had a dominant regional player named Harlow Distribution that had operated there for 26 years and treated new entrants the way long-established institutions treat disruption. Not with panic, but with the slow, deliberate pressure of something that has been in place long enough to believe it's permanent. They undercut Northbridge's initial contract bids by margins that weren't sustainable, which told Evelyn they were willing to lose money in the short term to keep Northbridge from gaining a foothold. She called James into her office on a Wednesday afternoon in November and closed the door, which she rarely did. "How bad is Michigan?" she asked. James sat down and didn't sugarcoat it. He was not a man who sugarcoated things, which was one of the reasons she'd hired him. "We've lost 3 bids in the last 6 weeks, all of them to Harlow at prices I don't understand how they're sustaining." "They're not sustaining them, they're absorbing them." "Right, so the question is how long they can absorb and whether we have the patience to wait them out." Evelyn looked at the window. Outside, the November sky was the flat gray of a city that has accepted winter as a condition of existence. "What's their client satisfaction record?" James pulled out his phone, scrolled. "Mixed. The large clients are fine. The smaller regional ones have some documented complaints. Delivery windows not met. Damage claims that took a long time to resolve. Nothing catastrophic, just the kind of thing that accumulates." "That's where we go," Evelyn said. "Not at their big accounts. We find the smaller clients who are quietly unhappy, and we show them specifically what we offer differently. Not better in a general sense, better in the specific ways that matter to them." "That's slower." "Yes," she said. "It's slower." James nodded once, the nod of someone who has already accepted the answer but needed to hear her say it. "Okay, I'll put together a target list. Get Deanna to help with the audit presentation. The transparency model is the differentiator here. Smaller clients are the ones who actually care about being able to see everything in real time. The big ones have compliance teams who manage that relationship. The small ones are the owner-operator level. They want to know where their shipment is at 2 in the morning, and they want to be able to see it themselves." James left, and Evelyn sat with the Michigan problem for another 10 minutes before moving to the next thing on her list. She did not catastrophize. She did not pretend it wasn't a problem. She filed it accurately, a real obstacle that would require patience and precision and probably 6 months before it resolved. And she moved on, because there were 6 other things on the list, and they all required her attention today. This was the part of running a company that no one talks about in the way it deserves to be talked about. Not the trials, not the storm response, not the moments that make it into articles. The Wednesday afternoons with the door closed, going through problems that don't have clean solutions. The steady accumulation of decisions made under uncertainty with incomplete information and no guarantee of outcome. The work of maintaining clarity when everything around you is asking you to simplify it in one direction or another. Evelyn was not always good at it. She had weeks where her judgment felt off, where she second-guessed decisions she'd already made and made new ones she wasn't sure about, and went home on Fridays with the particular fatigue of someone who has been carrying something heavy without being able to set it down. She had a difficult month in the spring of her 5th year when a key operations manager quit unexpectedly for a competitor, and 2 client contracts came up for renewal at the same time, and she handled the manager's departure badly, not cruelly, but she was less gracious about it than she should have been, said something in a team meeting that was more pointed than the situation required and had to go back and acknowledge it, which she did, directly, and without making it into a performance of accountability. "I was sharper than I needed to be last Tuesday," she told the team. "I want to name that. It wasn't about any of you, and it shouldn't have landed the way it did." There was a brief, slightly awkward silence of the kind that follows when leaders say things that leaders don't usually say. Then Deanna said, "Appreciated," and the meeting moved on, and the moment passed, and the team's trust in her was slightly stronger afterward than it had been before, because trust is built in those moments more than in the good ones. Michigan took 8 months, not 6. By the following summer, Northbridge had 5 active clients in the state, all of them smaller regional operators who had come through the process. James and Deanna had designed specific, honest, zero pressure. Harlow Distribution was still operating. They were not going anywhere. But the market was no longer theirs alone, and the clients Northbridge had there were loyal in the way clients become loyal when they've been treated honestly during a sales process rather than sold to. Calvin Park, the 83rd employee, turned out to be exactly what Deanna's report had suggested. By the end of his first year, he had redesigned a section of the route coordination software that had been clunky since Mark first built it, doing it in his own time without being asked and presenting it to Mark directly rather than going around him. Mark had looked at it for a long time, asked 3 questions, made 2 small adjustments, and implemented it. He told Evelyn about it in passing, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had built a team that was improving itself. "He's good," Mark said. "I know," Evelyn said. "Keep mentoring him." "I'm not really a mentor type." "You mentored yourself through 4 years of working for me," she said. "You're more of a mentor type than you think." Mark looked at her with the expression he always had when she said something he didn't immediately want to agree with. Then he said, "I'll think about it," and walked away. And 3 weeks later, she heard he and Calvin were having regular Tuesday afternoon technical reviews that Calvin had apparently asked for, and Mark had apparently agreed to after giving it approximately 0 additional thought beyond what he claimed. This was how the culture of the place maintained itself, not through policies or mission statements, though those existed and were taken seriously, but through the accumulation of small choices made by people who had internalized what the company actually valued. It was not something Evelyn could have manufactured or enforced. She could only model it and hire for it and make it clear, consistently and without drama, that it was what she expected. The rest was up to the people. That had always been the part that required the most faith. Ruth Callahan came for a board visit in September of year 5 and walked through the building in a way that told Evelyn she was looking at it carefully rather than just observing it. Afterward, they sat in Evelyn's office, and Ruth was quiet for a moment, which with Ruth meant she was organizing something she wanted to say precisely. "You know what I notice?" Ruth said. "Tell me." "Nobody here seems afraid." She paused. "I've been in a lot of companies. Most of them have a layer of fear underneath everything else. Fear of the wrong person, fear of making a mistake, fear of being seen as not enough. It's usually how you know who holds the power and how they hold it." She looked around the office, the window, the ordinary desk, the absence of any decorative signal of authority. "I don't feel that here." Evelyn thought about it. "We still have politics," she said. "People still want credit and get frustrated when they don't get it. There are still personality conflicts and bad days." "I know," Ruth said. "I'm not describing perfection. I'm describing the absence of fear as the default operating condition. That's different, and it's genuinely rare." Evelyn sat with that. She thought about the 41st floor on the morning she had set her badge down on a conference table while a room full of people waited to see what she would do. She thought about what fear had looked like in that building, not just on that morning, but all the years before it. The particular way people in that building had learned to manage upward, to be careful, to read Damien's mood before they said anything honest. The energy that went into protecting themselves instead of doing their work. "It's possible to build something different," she said finally. "That's really all I can tell you with certainty. Whether this lasts, whether we maintain it as we grow, I don't know. I'm going to keep trying." Ruth looked at her. "That's the most honest answer anyone has ever given me to that question." "You asked an honest question." Ruth smiled, a real one, brief, more valuable for its rarity. "Yes," she said. "I did." They talked for another hour about the expansion, about Michigan, about a potential partnership in the logistics technology space that Patrick Seo had surfaced, and that Ruth had initial reservations about, and that Evelyn was not yet sure about either. They disagreed about the timeline for one capital decision and agreed, after 40 minutes, on a middle path that neither of them had initially proposed. This was how their working relationship had always functioned. Neither deferring, neither dominating, both committed enough to the outcome to stay in the friction until it produced something better than either position had started with. When Ruth left, Evelyn sat alone in her office as the afternoon light moved across the floor in the long, slanted way of September light in Chicago, different from any other month, carrying the particular quality of a season in transition. She was 58 years old, she had gray hair, she did nothing to change, and a lower back that gave her trouble in cold weather, and a watch she'd been wearing for 11 years, and a niece who called twice a week, and a company with 83 people in it who came to work in a building that used to mean one thing and now meant another. She was not finished. There were problems that didn't have solutions yet, and growth that hadn't happened, and mistakes she hadn't made yet that she would make and would have to account for. The story was not over because stories like this are not the kind that end. They are the kind that continue, changing shape, finding new complications, asking the same essential questions in different forms. What do you owe the people who depend on you? What do you do when the system you're inside stops being worth protecting? How do you maintain your own honesty when the world around you has made a different choice? Evelyn Carter did not have final answers to these questions. She had working answers, the kind you hold loosely, prepared to revise when the evidence requires it. She had a building and a team and a track record of making decisions she could explain and stand behind. She had the accumulated evidence of 5 years of trying to do it differently and mostly, imperfectly, stubbornly succeeding. Outside the window, Chicago was preparing for another evening, another night, another morning after that. The lake was out there somewhere, dark and cold and indifferent, older than the city built along its edge, older than any of the ambitions played out in the buildings along its shore. Evelyn picked up her phone, called Maya. "Hey," Maya said. "How was your day?" "Long," Evelyn said. "Good, both." "That's your favorite kind." "It is," Evelyn said, and found to her own mild surprise that she was smiling.